Hi, I'm Mark Lieberman with Nostalgic Motoring in Auburn Hills, Michigan, and today I'm bringing to you a very interesting race car. This is a 1936 Singer, one-off car. This was built by Al Singer, the Singer Special, in 1936. He and his brother constructed this car basically from scratch. It has an aluminum body, a very unusual Voelker 205 cubic inch engine, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that shortly. But the configuration was really unique, and Al raced this car for a number of years very successfully in the Midwest. And the other thing that you'd see about these cars as they were building a following through the 30s, 40s, and 50s is that these cars remained a sport class. So you had these independent guys building incredible cars and challenging technologies. And I'll show you some of those unusual technologies that he incorporated in this car. The brakes being one of them. If you take a look at the front brakes on this, you'll notice that there are no backing plates. It allowed them to service them very quickly during the race. The other thing is that they used a variety of components in this. Both Miller and Duesenberg components were combined in order to make a very unusual front braking system. Well, and then of course, he needed to have a competitive suspension, so he used a modified Model A axle that was relatively light, had a single spring, and allowed him to dial in the front suspension the way he wanted it. So between the brakes and the front axle and suspension, that gave him the front end that he wanted on this car. Moving towards the rear, you'd see other things that were typical of the day in one of these sprint cars. A set of Stewart-Warner gauges to give you a full reading of what was going on under the hood. But you'll notice something else that was kind of unusual, certainly by today's standards. You certainly had an accelerator pedal and the clutch in the footwell compartment, but there was no brake in there. You had a hand brake out here on the left side of the car, and that's what you used in order to stop the car. You'll also notice that there's another unit here on this side, on the left side of the car, that's a pump. And that actually primes the carburetors. That sends fuel from the tank, pressurizes it up into the carburetors, and gives it the ability to start when cold and fire up, hopefully instantly, when they got these things going. Well, let's talk a little bit about this unusual Voelker engine that that I mentioned earlier. 205 cubic inch. They claimed it was 400 horsepower, but I struggle to understand how and they built this particular engine for it in 1939, how 1939 technology out of only 205 cubic inches would produce 400 horsepower, although they did some fabulous tricks to this. 18-to-1 compression, super high compression, and they ran it on methanol. So you had a lot of powerful explosions taking place. Of course, it's a dual overhead cam, aluminum head, aluminum cylinders, and they actually mounted that to a 1923 Packard engine block. That was common use for Voelker at the time, but when I say common, Voelker engines in general weren't common. As I understand it, they only built 4 engines in this configuration. 2 for race boats and 2 for race cars. And this is one of the unusual original engines. So inside the cabin, you've got the shifter dead center of the steering wheel, and it's a 3-speed manual Ford transmission modified from a Model A. It was common at the time, relatively strong trans, and gave him some flexibility in terms of gear ratios. There's a switch here on the floor that was your fuel cutoff. You have a separate switch for ignition on the dash. Your fuel tank was mounted here behind the driver, and you had an oil tank mounted in the cowl itself. The rear end, again, a Ford selection from a the one that's in there now is a 1938 Ford rear end, and that was part of the subsequent refurbishment that took place in preparing this car for races beyond 1939, 1941. I think, in fact, in 41, it ran successfully in New York. One of the other things that is worth noting on these vehicles is that this car doesn't have a starter. In order to start this car, you had to push this car with another vehicle in order to fire it up on the track. And while pushing this car was inconvenient, it wasn't all race cars that had to be done this way, although quite a few did. In fact, if you'll recall the video that we did on the 1913 Model T Speedster, that car also required either push starting or crank starting it. It also had no starter. Now, in this particular car, yes, you had to push start it, but what a roar you would get out of this magnificent chrome exhaust on the one side. Yeah, 6 cylinders, twin overhead cam, updraft Winfield carburetors. This thing would be throaty to hear it run. You'll see some other things that are really quite nice in the way of fine finishes and execution of this. Took the time to create an unusually finished dashboard in this. He has plaques mounted to the dash as well, and even a St. Christopher medallion. He wants everybody on his side when he was racing this car. Al Singer sold the car after he campaigned it initially and ended up actually reacquiring it some years later, and then he did the restoration on the car himself before passing, and it remained in his wife's garage for many years until being extracted and coming here. You'll see some other really neat features on it. The Daytona wheels with the knockoffs, a common period wheel that was both lightweight and strong, and a good selection for racing. These cars, as an overall presentation, really varied greatly depending upon the folks that actually built the car, and some of these were highly successful in racing. One of the things that you'd see at the time was that there was a lot of following to these cars. And as a result of that, there were a lot of fans, and there's many race bills that were printed up, and you'd have really groups of people that would follow a specific racer from track to track just to cheer them on and see him win. This car was no exception. It was well known and had many articles written about it over the years. And watch for more things, because we may indeed try to fire this baby up and get it on the road and give you guys a real treat of hearing and seeing a 18-to-1 compression Voelker engine in a 1936 Singer actually go down the road. Pretty exciting. Thanks for joining us on this. Wait for some more videos on the 1936 Singer.